Good morning, Team Alabama. We are going to continue in Hatchet. Please join me in reading on page 116, and we are in the first full paragraph at the top part of the page 116. To where he wanted to die, he had settled into the gray funk deeper and still deeper until finally, in the dark, he had gone up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. Madness, a hissing madness that took his brain. There had been nothing for them, and then he had tried to become nothing. But the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do, and he had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end, and slept only didn't sleep. With his eyes closed and his mind open, he lay on the rock through the night, lay and hated and wished for it to end, and thought the word, cloud down. Cloud down. Through that awful night, over and over, the word, wanting all his clouds to come down. But in the morning, he was still there, on his side, and the sun came up, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the cuts on his arm, the dry blood turning black. He saw the blood and hated what he had done to himself when he was the old Brian and was weak. And two things came into his mind, two true things. He was not the same. The plain passing changed him. The disappointment cut him down and made him new. He was not the same, and he would never be again like he had been. That was one of the true things, the new things. And the other one was that he would not die. He would not let death in again. He was new. Of course, he had made a lot of mistakes. He smiled now, walking up the lake shore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes, the mistakes that came before he realized that he had to find new ways to be what he had become. He had made new fire, which he now kept going using partially rotten wood, because the punky wood would smolder for many hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right for a while. His first bow was a disaster that almost blinded him. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs carefully until the bow looked beautiful, and then he had spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were willow, straight and with the bark peeled, and the fire hardened the points and split a couple of them to make forked points, as he had done with the spear. He had no feathers, so he just left them bare, figuring for fish they only had to travel a few inches. He had no string, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had long laces, too long, and he found that one lace cut in half would take care of both shoes, and that left the other lace for a bowstring. All seemed to be going well until he tried a test shot, and he put an arrow to the string and pulled it back to his chest, pointed it at the dirt hummock, and at that precise instant the bow wood exploded in his hand, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. 2 pieces actually stuck him into his forehead, just above his eyes, and had they been only slightly lower, they would have blinded him. 2 stiff mistakes. In his mental journal, he listed them to tell his father, and listed all the mistakes. He had made a new bow with slender limbs and a more fluid, gentle pull, but could not hit the fish, though he sat in the water and was in the end surrounded by a virtual cloud of small fish. It was infuriating. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more than an inch away, release the arrow, only to miss. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish again and again, but the fish didn't get hurt. Finally, after hours, he stuck the arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for a fish to come close. And while he was waiting, he noticed that the water seemed to make the arrow bend or break in the middle. Of course, he had forgotten that water refracts, bends light. He had learned that somewhere in some class. Maybe it was biology. He couldn't remember, but it did bend light, and that meant that the fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim just under them. He would not forget his first hit, not ever. A round-shaped fish with golden sides as gold as the sun, stopped in front of the arrow, and he aimed just beneath it, at the bottom edge of the fish, and released the arrow, and there was a bright flurry, a splash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow and raised it up, and the fish was on the end, wiggling against the blue sky. He held the fish against the sky until it stopped wiggling, and held it and looked to the sky and felt his throat tighten and swell and fill with pride at what he had done. He had done food. With his bow, with an arrow fashioned by his own hands, he had done food and had found a way to live. The bow had given him this way, and he exulted in it. He exulted in it. Exalted might be a word you want to add. And refracted. In the bow, in the arrow, in the fish, in the hatchet, in the sky, he stood and walked from the water, still holding the fish and arrow and bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms and as they were part of him. He had food. He cut a green willow fork and held the fish over the fire until the skin crackled and peeled away, and the meat inside was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth with his tongue to get the juices out of them, but streaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought then, ever get enough. And all that first new day he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooking it and eating it, and then back to the lake, shooting a fish, cooking it and eating it, and on that way until it was dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water, and with that thought that they might work it for bait, and the other fish came by the hundreds to clean them. He could take his pick of them, like a store, he thought, just like a store, and he could not remember later how many he ate that day, but he thought it must have been over 20. It had been a feast day, his first feast day, and a celebration of being alive, and the new way that he had of getting food. And by the end of that day, when it became dark and he lay next to the fire with his stomach full of fish and grease from the meat smeared around his mouth, he could feel new hope building in him. Not hope that he would be rescued, that was gone, but hope in his knowledge. Hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope. He thought that night. I am full of tough hope. Okay, guys, that's the end of chapter 13. Please go ahead and add a few facts to your Google Doc. And if you're not at 50, we should be getting 50. You may always go up to 70 for some extra credit points, but please go ahead and get those in your Google Doc. Have a great rest of your day.